Hello, everyone. Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. We would take a few more minutes before we get started. Give us like about 5 minutes before we start the session.
Nice, so many people.
Yeah, that's pretty good to know.
Yeah,
Of course,
many
you are.
familiar names, which is interesting.
Yeah, great. Then, welcome back once again, and we will kickstart this today's session. So again, just so you know, this session is being recorded. We will share it once we are done with the session. We might do a bit of editing here and there, but it would still remain intact what you have seen and what you will see today. So with that said, let's get started and see what we are doing. So basically, we are an online community where we strive to improve the understanding of DevSecOps or DevOps in general in security community. And we do it in a bunch of ways. So as usual, we do this DevSecOps live meetup, which is an online meetup. And we also occasionally conduct workshops where you can learn about more about DevSecOps. So Mario is going to share a couple of links at the end of this presentation where we would be hosting these workshops. So please stay back so that you get to know that. And then we also have a DevSecOps newsletter wherein we gather the best of resources over a 15-day period, 14 to 15 days. Once in 14 to 15 days, we send out this newsletter to about 2,000 folks. If you're interested to learn the latest and greatest in DevSecOps and what's happening in the arena of DevSecOps, then definitely check out the DevSecOps newsletter. Apart from that, we also open source a lot of tools, resources. For example, we have awesome threat modeling. We have a DevSecOps University, DevSecOps Studio, which is a distribution to learn DevSecOps. So apart from that, we will also be conducting a 24-hour DevSecOps conference soon. So stay tuned with that information there. And then, so a bit of housekeeping. So all of you are on mute, so you would be on mute throughout the session. We will try to see if we can unmute you at the end of the session when you can ask questions. But then feel free to chat and ask questions over here, or you can also use DevSecOps Live hashtag over Twitter or LinkedIn to pose a question to Mario. And then, of course, the panels and discussions will last about 1.5 hours. And we don't call this a webinar because we don't try to keep it in a structured way. And it's deliberate because we want to bring the feeling of community rather than some webinar backed by a corporate entity, and then we are trying to sell you something, which is what we are not doing here today. Okay. So of course, if you have registered, we will share the session with you over the email. Now, today we have a very special guest, which Mario, who has done amazing work in terms of how do you define strategy with the help of Waddle mapping, Teams topology, and he has also created a nice archetype model, which he will be sharing today. You would be blown away with his expertise in terms of taking complex questions, complex processes, and making them easy to understand for anyone. So with that, I think I'll give this, the host rights to Mario in a minute. But again, once again, a quick reminder, if you want to ask questions, you can use DevSecOps Live as a hashtag. So if you ask a question with that hashtag, we will be able to find you and then ask that question to Mario. You can also use, as I mentioned before, the Q&A option, the chat option to ask any questions. But please be sure that you select the option everyone. Otherwise, we will not be able to see the question. Right? I think with that said, I will make you the host, Mario.
Thank you.
There you go.
Okay, there we go. So, my screen, and let's do this now. Okay, can you see my screen? The presentation one? Yep. Okay, so welcome everyone. So today what we'll be talking about is a model that I've been developing for a few months now, that I've had the opportunity to speak with a few of you. about how to use an archetype-based model to talk about DevSecOps. Right. So the name is To DevSecOps or not to DevSecOps. Is that a question? So we will look at the two schools of thought within the InfoSec industry about the word DevSecOps. We're going to talk about who is it for. Then I'm going to introduce the actual archetype model, and I'm going to introduce to you the three archetypes that make up the model. And then we're going to talk about some of the bottlenecks and constraints that these archetypes will typically find when wanting to adopt DevSecOps. And how we can help those archetypes both with the governance and maturity, and also helping them with how the security organization is actually structured. And we will finish with thinking about if we do need DevSecOps or not. So in the security industry, there are overall two schools of thought with regards to DevSecOps. These are all people that I highly respect and look up to, but I believe there are underlying themes to both sides of the argument. So those advocating for DevSecOps, they usually have arguments that relate to collaboration between the different teams, and there's a point-in-time need whilst the engineering teams build security into their practices. Those which are less impressed by the use of the word DevSecOps, they seem to focus their arguments on the possibility for the siloing of activities and fear in relation to current role identities. And what the focus on the fact that security needs to be in the hands of engineering, because that's where it's needed, that's where it makes a difference on a daily basis, and not in some governance function that can be detached from the development, where ownership is not effective. Okay, so the doers must own and have agency over the scope and the outcomes of security. There's also a third, less common view that DevSecOps is compliance too, and I couldn't agree less with that. So no one called security engineering compliance 10 years ago, and I don't think we should be starting now. It's good if, or that you are doing it, as expectedly it will make compliance easier, but they're not the same thing, right? And with poor communication, they can even be completely detached from each other. Right? It can only become compliant or help compliance if we have effective traceability between the policy requirements and the technical controls. And also when communication between the different stakeholders allow one part of the process to inform the other part of the process during both design and operations. But this is the opinion of security professionals. So we may be the ones with the bigger interest in DevSecOps, but we're not its only customers, I don't think. So who are we to, or who can we serve with the word DevSecOps? And I think it can be beneficial to both control and governance functions, which InfoSec is only one part of it. So you will have other, depending on the organization, you'll have other silos or other functions that may benefit from this, like service management, for instance, but also to the engineering organization. So, but for those, it will serve different and sometimes even opposing objectives. So the model that we're going to talk about next is meant to provide some basis so that the different archetypes within organizations can have meaningful conversations. So this is the structure of the DevOps security archetype model. So this was built on exploration with peers and our experience in consulting to organizations of all sizes. So from startups also to government and healthcare institutions, and appreciating the differences between them. Right? When we are trying to develop a tailored strategy for their needs as a business. But also from understanding what the security unicorns do different and how they approach the same challenges. So we have three basic archetypes in this model. So we have Dave, the Rainbow Maker or the Magic Maker, which is a reference to a cartoon that you'll probably all remember that exists for over a decade, where we have in a boxing ring all the shiny security controls on one side and then Dave on the other side, who's the person that clicks all the links and finds creative ways to avoid security. So Dave is measured and rewarded on delivering features in stable platforms. So we will have an overall focus on speed and stability, but ensuring that he can support the business in making money and be successful whilst removing any impediments to that speed, though not necessarily in a reckless way. So Rick is a reference to how most other people outside of compliance tend to perceive control functions, particularly InfoSec, which still has a big reputation for being the department of no. So everyone else usually refers to Rick by changing the first letter of his name. So I'm sure you understand what I mean by that. And for the creation of policies and procedures that Rick expects to be adhered to at all times in order to keep the organization compliant to a standard, or at least to be in a position to evidence due diligence has been performed and help manage cyber risk. Though the problem is that these are often uncontextualized, and there's no real understanding of the realities of business operations and the impact that those rules may have. So RIC is measured and rewarded for identifying and managing non-compliances. So passing audits successfully and generally for helping avoid bad outcomes. So there's an overall focus on quality. It's a biased and narrow view of quality, but it's based on an understanding of quality of all the things that are being produced by the development organization. And finally, we have STU, the security unicorn. So this is a reference to those individuals that have good embedded security practices in their engineering process and have ownership and agency over security in the products and services that they're accountable for. So security is generally perceived as another element of the quality assurance, as is performance, as is cost, and there are other metrics. And security is never seen as something that someone else does. So they figured out, what sets them apart is they figured out how to ensure that both quality and speed are not mutually exclusive, but they're actually mutually supportive. So this model is not just applicable to individuals, but also to the way the organizations operate. So we often find ourselves in a company which operates in a very gatekeeping fashion, but where we have multiple stakeholders that are mostly rainbow makers. So particularly in startups, so when they fail to account for cultural fit of security people, they are going to have whole organizations and processes that are geared towards rainbow making, being as speedy as possible, etc. And the few gatekeeping stakeholders that are likely to have some permanent frustrations with the lack of their preferred form of governance. Okay. So in the security unicorn organizations, they figured out how to do security at scale. So we're talking about the Netflixes, the Facebooks, Adena Health, GitHub, and many others that we know some of the things that they do and how they treat security internally. So this model is meant to help us think about what their needs and expectations are, and then hopefully to create targeted plans to help them improve their outcomes and decrease their frustrations. One thing before we move further on the model is that many will default to seeing all gatekeepers as governance-focused individuals and all engineers as rainbow makers, which is not necessarily the case. So in practice, you are going to find governance people who have some characteristics and are largely aligned with rainbow making type archetype and vice versa. And also to note that the characteristics and constraints of each archetype, I define them on the model as the extremes of the triangle, right? So reality will usually be a bit more nuanced, but this model is more like a typology, so something to help us think, not something to categorize and put people in buckets with. So a big part of how rainbow makers are perceived by gatekeepers is with claims that they're either negligent, stupid, or just plain don't care about security. Right? It fails to realize that no developer creates insecure code deliberately. So we should be assuming that people mean well and that they're producing the best quality artifacts with the current knowledge that they possess. So visibility with the knowledge they possess, with the visibility they have, and also the overall constraints. So time is one of them, but so is culture, imposed by the demands of their practice in their organizational context. So the main challenge usually relates to the lack of situational awareness with regards to the security of what they're producing. And this is mainly a process and social practice issue, and failing to account for the cognitive load of their already difficult practice, and it's those that are failing them. Some of the essential characteristics will also include lack of integrated security telemetry. So they typically won't have tooling that can help them identify vulnerabilities that they should address. There will generally be an avoidance of engagement with the compliance teams as they tend to misunderstand the context or even what the scope of their job is. Right? So they'd even go so far as to suggest that compliance doesn't understand what it takes to get the job done. In the experience is one of those mandating things as opposed to any real collaboration. So they only see compliance when preparing for audits or on annual awareness courses. Right? So another problem is that there are usually no agreed or secure baselines in place or modeling of threats of the systems that are being built. So there isn't a shared mental model by the team on what can go wrong with the system and what measures can be put in place to actually mitigate against those problems. So the next one is not a security thing per se, but there's usually limited automated testing overall. So the practices that security could potentially leverage to embed security into development process are usually missing too, right? That's not a security thing per se, but it affects security. Another problem is that there's usually no product level security reporting. So security is seen as an organizational thing, which leads it to being abstract, right? And reactive and uncontextualized, as opposed to being a product thing where the teams understand and manage their own backlogs according to the relative prioritization amongst all of the other functional bugs and improvement work that they have to deal with. Insecurity is also generally perceived as someone else's job and not something that the needs need to manage themselves. So there's the expectation that at best someone needs to give them the requirements that they need to work towards delivering, or worse yet, security is generally absent through the life cycle and seen as the things that you need to fix as part of the output of a pen test or an audit. So those are usually the essential characteristics of this archetype. So with regards to the gatekeepers, one of the big complaints that I hear from rainbow makers is that the gatekeepers are either thick or business averse or just plain difficult to deal with. Right? With all of these esoteric scenarios of what can go wrong or how the world is going to end in the next 3 months. So what more likely is happening is that the gatekeepers lack an understanding of how control reliance, so particularly the form and appropriateness of how to build security controls in a DevOps environment actually works, and how that affects the software development lifecycle, and also what automation can mean for their practice. But it's also about inertia to change due to having had success with how we did security in a non-prem, non-continuous integration environment. So most of the principles are still applicable for sure, but they have different forms, which doesn't fit with our current model of what good security looks like. So here we have mainly an issue of team topology and understanding of the evolution of team topologies, and also poor traceability between what the engineers do and the compliance objectives, what the compliance objectives are, and that is what's failing them. So on both of these, I wanted to make sure that that we get the conversation and the wording right. I'm a firm believer that it's the way we are setting up processes, are setting our organizations, are setting our processes that are failing people. It's not our people failing us, right? And I think that's a good mental model to have and a good lens to look at the problem. So some of the essential characteristics of gatekeepers is that they will usually have or expect gated processes in meetings with review boards to express their happiness or have the opportunity to effectively block something. Right? So most organizations claiming agility and DevOps still try to embed all of these committees and gates in some fashion. So they will usually have very limited understanding of modern development practices, and they do not trust their engineering teams with claims that are being cowboys happening often, nor do they have any trust in automation, right? And the benefits of the short feedback loops. What I mean by that is that no matter what you do or what you evidence you can provide, they would still prefer to have a pen tester manually check your application for every release, right? If they could get away with it. So they usually develop policies which are verbatim copies of security standards like ISO 27001 and ISO 27002, which is the real problem because it goes into too much outdated detail, in my opinion, and without any understanding of or consideration for the context that those policies need to live in. Right? And they are usually written in ways that rainbow makers can't make sense of, right? Or they don't understand what it means to their context, which removes or contributes to the rainbow makers not having a sense of agency and ownership, right? If you can't understand what the policies mean to you, you're not going to be happy taking ownership of anything coming from them. So as we had a recent paradigm shift in co-evolution of practices in software development, they will also usually lack the technical knowledge to fully understand the new patterns that are in use. And they will think of cloud systems and orchestration with a mental model for on-prem systems, right? And that's also part of the challenge. So they haven't understood how distributed systems lead to availability. They haven't understood how immutability refers to integrity and relates to integrity, or how designing for ephemerality can support confidentiality objectives. So, and finally, we've got Stu and the team of security unicorns, and they're okay. They have a great engineering culture, and they are a learning organization. So by learning organization in this context, I'm referring to the way that Andrew Clay Schaffer refers to it, which has a very specific meaning. So what he says is that a learning organization, that organizations become graduate studies in the skills that they require to be successful. So it's not about rainbow makers or gatekeepers being good generic experts in their own functional silos, in their own functional expertise, but it's on learning and having the requisite know-how and materials available to them to make your company successful on the context that it operates, right? And that means with the structure, it means the market they operate in, it means all of those things together. So there's true collaboration to establish good practices, and then trust that the teams are rooting for the same objectives and the same business benefits. So some of the essential characteristics. So for the unicorns, security is embedded into their practices and is not seen as something separate from product or service quality. So operating models such as SRE help make this clearer and simpler, but they're not a necessity. So teams understand the threat models of their applications and the failure modes of their applications. They do work to mitigate the occurrence of incidents and mitigating any potential impacts. So their process considers end-to-end security. And end-to-end, what I mean is that they understand what should be feedback that is being provided to developers at the IDE level. They understand the tests that need to how much security and which tests should be run after every commit, as opposed to a QA environment alongside full integration tests where we have more time to perform more tests. Right? So these things are all applied in the context of the development process and development practices. And they also understand what conditions need to be met before we expect the build to fail because of a security issue. And critically, developers understand how to manage false positives from their own code repositories, from their own context, right? So they've got agency over how security gets done. Also, compliance is code. In that gatekeepers, they don't tell or send a spreadsheet to the rainbow makers that they need to fill, but the security requirements are expressed as code in tests that the software needs to pass, as with other elements of quality. So there's less of a command and control, ivory tower, and hiding behind the keyboard type approach from the compliance teams, and there's more true collaboration and even guided adaptability, where constant iterations are building up the overall security posture of the organization. So that was kind of the basis of the model. So talking about the different archetypes and what are the usual characteristics that they're affected by. So now we're going to talk a bit about the bottlenecks for the two archetypes at the bottom. So I'd argue that the number one challenge for rainbow makers is really the lack of security telemetry in the form of a baseline. Right? So in many organizations, this covers what we would consider some of the basics in DevSecOps. So dependency scanning, static code analysis, secret scanning, and basic configuration hardening. Right? Another bottleneck is usually in the form of product visibility of the security work. So I go and have a conversation with the devs and engineers, and they can tell me off the top of their head at least 20 problems, security problems that they know about in their product, but I go to their backlog and I don't see those on the backlog, right? And there isn't any periodic review or alignment to business goals or attributes, and the product owner may not even have heard about half of the security problems that the team know exist. Right? Security expertise is also often missing, either because it's not even identified as a need, or in places where it is, there's an overly optimistic and unrealistic expectation that all engineers or devs need to be security experts. So that fails to account for issues of cognitive load. Being a developer, sometimes with code bases with 2 or 3 different languages, is already hard enough. So we as security people, we need to have that in consideration, the cognitive load that we're putting on teams. And also issues with incentives, business priorities, that generate pushback on taking responsibility. So, and another thing that really doesn't help is bland vanilla approaches to security awareness that make this worse and not better. So poor process assurance and practices, in that the teams don't regularly perform the types of practices that increase the likelihood of creating secure software, like threat modeling, for instance, or the creation of tests to validate continuous working of the security controls. And one of the key problems is the low sense of agency and ownership for security, which is usually coupled with low expertise and the lack of telemetry. But it's a problem in and of itself, I think, which is created both by organizational design and also the separation of duties when it relates to security. So for the gatekeepers, one of the main challenges is around team topologies in the assignment of security responsibilities. So most of these are unbalanced with the needs of agency and autonomy of modern development practices. And unfortunately, we see the non-working extremes more often than not. So either gatekeepers take too much onto themselves. So what I mean by that is they don't stick to setting control objectives, and they own all of the policies and procedures and all of the governance, and thus become bottlenecks in the development process. And the guidance usually becomes uncontextualized and potentially wrong for development. Or on the other extreme, they just delegate the whole lot, assuming that they just can just deal about the ISMS and the audits. And they assume that the security know-how and the practices exist where they don't, and they don't actually provide support to build that know-how that can be shared by the product teams. So I still see more security budget being spent outside of the realm of the development process than for initiatives that would help with developer experience in the engineering experience of security. Even if it's not helping the front lines, the digital front lines of the organization, anything you do after that will be much more ineffective and cost much more to fix later. So some of these gated processes and out-of-band approvals are also typical expectations, and the usual expectation that there are forms and spreadsheets that need to be filled out by the dev or engineering teams, which really doesn't support process integration and effective collaboration. So security policies are also not written as code, or at least expressed as user stories, and in that way enabling better communication between the different parties. And there's also a command and control ivory tower type approach, right? Where a lot of compliance teams expect that all they need to do is send emails, and that the teams are going to drop everything they're doing because security is important, right? And they see themselves more as requirement setters than collaboration partners building more secure services. So there's also the issue of inertia. So inertia exists due to success of the past model. So, but having been good at securing on-prem environments doesn't necessarily make you qualified to secure an architecture of microservices and orchestration. So yes, some of the base principles still apply, but the form in which we do them is different. And many haven't kept their skills current or rely on their technical teams to educate them, right? So there's a lot of product-driven bolt-on security like we used to do on the 90s and early 2000s, which is a significant impediment to the integration of security practices by DevOps and engineering teams in the overall process. So those are kind of the main bottlenecks that I believe affect the two different archetypes. But there are some further challenges. So some of those challenges are on the aspect of communication between stakeholders, traceability and process to support them, the learning journey and the mental models that the teams currently have and how they need to evolve, the evolution of practices within the organization, and finally, the team topologies and the organizational structure of security. So part of the communication challenge is that in order to enable a better communication, we really need to consider or understand the mental models of the different stakeholders, which often align to the structure of their management systems. Right? So you show me the management systems, how people are managing their work to either a gatekeeping, to either of the gatekeepers or the rainbow makers, and you usually have an understanding of how the mental model of organizing work and thinking about work actually works for those particular types of stakeholders. Also, the time span and types of stories for different archetypes use it to tell each other, and also the language that they use to communicate concerns. So this slide is in reference to John Allspau's material in resilience engineering. In that different stakeholders may talk about their systems, what their systems are through the lens of their mental models. So the things that they build their systems with and the actual products and services that they provide. So they're all going to use the same names potentially, but their understanding of what the system is will be very different. This is not a bad thing though, right? So this heterogeneity and diversity is what actually makes organizations more resilient. That's what adds resilient to social systems as well. And this should be encouraged, but it can introduce challenges of communicating between these different stakeholders. So first we have the time span of the narratives, which are different. Right? So typically gatekeepers talk a lot about risk. So there's a lot of talk about uncertainty and possibility, and they usually talk in time spans which are either yearly or multi-year cycles of transformation, change, of audit, whatever may be the case, and trying to align with the strategic vision of the organization. Right? While rainbow makers, they like to understand what they can do here and now, okay, over the coming sprint, over the next few months at best. Right? And connecting these two types of narratives is not trivial, right? But it's part of the work that we need to do if we're going to enable better communication and collaboration. Also, this refers to something by Jay Bloom, which is, I would suggest everyone should have a look about whole work in the sociotechnicity of DevOps, which is where the diagram comes from originally. So the language of these stakeholders use is also largely different, right? And not conducive to direct collaboration. So something that often requires what are called boundary spanners. So individuals or roles that can help break the communication gap as they have a good understanding of both domains. So that's usually the capacity that I'm hired into organizations to help them with, right? Is to understand what the compliance teams are on about, what the engineering teams actually want to do, and find a way to actually get them to communicate with each other in a better way. So missing those, and even with those, we should aim to make the language that is being used more traceable, right? If we cannot make it shared, right? So ideally, we should aim as much as possible to have shared language that we can use to communicate, and we both mean the same thing, and we both understand what is being said. But failing that, we should aim for at least a traceable one. And there are usually two things that I call syndromes that are often associated with this communications mismatch. So the first one is what I call the new regulation syndrome. And I've seen this happen with both GDPR and also the medical device regulation, MDR. In that gatekeepers like to say it depends, right? But the rainbow makers actually need a specification, right? So this type of loop really doesn't help. There's also another syndrome that I like to call uncontextualized policy syndrome, where gatekeepers write all these pretty words on paper that have no chance at all of being made operational without significant operational impact, or even completely miss what it takes to get the job done from the point of view of the rainbow makers. So these policies will typically live in Word documents or spreadsheets that rainbow makers hear about on an annual awareness training, but couldn't actually find them if their lives depended on it, or even have any understanding of what it means to their daily practices. So when they come in the morning and they develop and release code, they don't understand what those Word documents mean to what they're doing on a daily basis. So For this, I think we need to start thinking about using the concepts of time span of discretion that I told you about, the time span of the different concerns, and start actually using different governance systems for each, right? So we should think about governance models happening at different time scales. So exposing security concerns in the specialist appropriate language that can work for both parties, right? So figuring out appropriate methods to do security. So if the gatekeepers are better used to kind of full governance systems in ticking boxes in overall governance frameworks, um, let them use them, okay? Something like the Department of Defense Enterprise DevSecOps reference works well for this type, for gatekeepers, right? Just don't try and shove these types of frameworks down the rainbow makers' throats, right? Because that's not how they see their practice. So something like the maturity model that we were helping develop at Practical DevSecOps in Hisn, which is much more iterative in nature and has it's much better understood by engineers, right? Because it's something that they can say, okay, I understand what I can do here and now at the maturity that I am and what the next step is going to look like, right? But then the engineers can then create a map or a specification around it and be happy about owning, actually having some agency and ownership of that process because they understand the steps that they need to give. But then there's still the process that we need to map and trace it, right? So that each stakeholder can have a look at their governance system and understand what it means to the other ones. In that they can agree on mutually beneficial next steps forward that can help meet requirements from both sides. Another example is through mapping something like a checklist formatted standard, such as the Application Security Verification Standard from OWASP, which can help governance teams, compliance teams, and can also be mapped to things such as the OWASP 20 proactive controls or the OWASP cheat sheets, where the rainbow makers can have clarity on what the gatekeepers actually mean and what they need to do about it. So they can have clear specifications, they can have code snippets that can look at and understand what they can do in their own agency to fix some of those security issues. And we need to get better at using metadata to connect these together. This is something that a lot of people have been seeing a lot of conversations lately, but this is something that as an industry we really need to get better at. Because gatekeepers and rainbow makers, they usually try to get assurance either that the engineering process is working well or that the security considerations are working well by looking at different parts of the process, right? So answering things such as what tests are we running, what standards are we meeting, what hardening do we have in place, all of those things. When in 2020, there's no reason why we shouldn't just be able to query our production clusters, our operational environments for the metadata and get an accurate picture of all the security validations which happen throughout the process, right? We just need to add metadata to it, right? And we need to start thinking about how we can enrich parts of our process all the way from risk analysis up to the point where we've got systems in production and make sure that we can look at one place, ideally the end state, the production cluster, and then we can have a conversation about all of the tests and all of the assurances that our systems went through before they reach the live environment. And that way we have a single place where we can have, that both teams can look at to have meaningful conversations about what security looks like. But the question is still, how can we effectively connect these practices between risk management and threat modeling? So this is using a lot of you know me already. You know I'm a big fan of SABSA, and this is one of the things that we do in SABSA security architecture modeling. Gatekeepers really need to think more about key risk indicators that can be agreed at the product and at the organizational level. So collaboration with product owners would be key for this, which can then help inform the scope and focus of threat modeling sessions and what it means to the threats that we're looking out for, the mitigations that we're going to put in place, and what will give us the validations, preferably in an automated fashion, that our controls are still in place, right? So this is what will allow our security programs to scale in doing it once and having the continuous validation that the controls are present and working as expected. And we need the process to actually connect them. So more often, we have risk analysis processes which immediately define mitigation plans, which may or may not be considerate of the operational constraints or trade-offs that those risk mitigation plans are suggesting. So part of having teams own and have agency over the security of what they build means that we need to give them the opportunity to contribute. And aligning this with the development lifecycle means that we need to have stories attached to them that are part of product roadmaps and not just left field tasks from gatekeepers and compliance teams that are not part of the work that the teams are managing. So a cycle of performing a risk analysis to inform engineering, which then triggers targeted threat modeling and on which mitigations we're going to put in place, that we can then trace back to the risk treatment plan and we can validate that it's addressing the outcome of the risk analysis, right? And do this as something that is part of the process of how we do think about security and about how we think about development.
Bio, before we go on,
Yep.
I have a couple of questions.
Sure.
One interesting one is how do we achieve or adhere to principle of segregation of duty in an agile environment or at scale for those who are coming from a more waterfall-y or traditional control-based security teams?
That's a very good question, and actually the slide that we're on. So so basically, a big part of the challenge there is an issue of trust, right? On one hand, we do need to have the segregation of duties, right? And I completely agree with that. The problem is one of control reliance. What I mean by that is that the problem with the segregation of duties is how we think, or the mental model of how we should approach segregation of duties. Okay? So in a non-prem world, non-continuous integration, that segregation of duties happened at the change control board level, at the cab, right? So we had a bunch of artifacts that were being produced by the development teams. They would come into cab with a number of artifacts that were going to be reviewed by the compliance teams, and they were going to check that the requirements were being met before moving on to the next stage, right? In a DevOps environment, we need to think about control reliance in a different way, right? So for instance, if you're using GitHub, you can define policies that every commit needs to be reviewed by at least 2 people or a particular type of role before the code gets deployed, right? And then you can think about, for instance, if you're just doing continuous integration, you can be sure that you add the security telemetry that you want, meaning static code analysis, your dependency checking, seeing if you're using insecure libraries, and then make sure that there's whoever is responsible for doing release management that has an input into the security team, or that at least the security team has visibility of the outputs before things are released into production, and have that check. But it's something that needs to be iterative. And that's actually so I would probably go back to this question in about 5 minutes, because this is exactly what I'm doing with the next 3 slides, is explain how what my proposal is to approach that. But I hope that made sense.
Yeah, so one more question here,
Yep.
an interesting question as well. So the question is, do you think the policy should be focused more on the implementation of the telemetry and the DevOps process rather than on how the developers do their job? Yeah.
I think it's a mix of both, I would say. So the issue with policies is that they usually tend to dictate more than they should, and they don't keep themselves to just setting control objectives, right? So modern development practices require that that development teams have agency and ownership over everything that goes through them, right? We're moving, even, this is probably not DevOps per se, but we're even moving towards, the industry is moving towards an idea of self-organizing teams, right? So it's the teams owning the backlogs, not necessarily the product owners, right? So we've got teams that are starting to become self-organizing units that understand all the business requirements to their product, and they manage their work appropriately, accordingly, right? So what I think is that it's a combination of both. We need to have security teams that set up control objectives, that they have they don't go to a level of detail enough that they're mandating particular approaches, so that we can leave the development teams with agency over the form that in which those security controls are going to be implemented. Right? So the compliance teams should be focusing more on you need to have a backup, you need to do some kind of risk analysis or threat modeling, you need to ensure that insecure libraries aren't used, right? But then the form that takes in the development process should be left to the teams, because if they don't have a sense of agency and ownership of how they approach security, they're always going to think of it as someone else's job to set and do, etc., and not have the ownership that is required at the security unicorn level. Yep.
Yep. I think.
So those two questions are actually related to what I'm talking about now. So let's go through this content. Maybe it makes it a bit clearer. So this is again using some content from Jay Bloom on what he calls futures. And the idea is that we have things, when we look at the world through the lens of our mental models, we've got a few things that we believe are possible. Some things we believe are plausible, and there's the realm of the possible, right? And then there's the realm of agency. So what is preferable? So if I was to have it my way, what would it look like, right? And I think this is a really good lens to look at some of the challenges with these archetypes. So these things won't come naturally to in this case for the gatekeepers, usually because there's an issue of trust in both the teams and the process or the automation. So we need to understand what some of those constraints are and how we can iteratively address them by meeting our stakeholders where they are. Okay? So what I mean by that is that left to their own device, a true gatekeeper will expect or prefer an independent code review in the pen test after every change, right? Because that's what their model of the world tells them good security is. But that we know would make security a bottleneck on the delivery process. But they can probably comprehend and agree on benefits of policy as code and threat modeling, right? So if we show them how they can benefit and how it can be connected and how it can be helpful, right? So policy as code in this instance can start with simple things such as checking cookies or the simple parts of ASVS, right? So I've been working in security for the best part of 20 years now, and I started hacking in 1998. And what I'm still yet to find a single pen test throughout my career that didn't have insecure cookies appear on the pen test report, right? And that's usually a really low barrier in something really simple to check with compliance as code, right? I actually did for OWASP DevSlop a session about 3 months ago where I talked about compliance as code using inspect, and I used cookie verification as part of that check, right? It's something that is really simple to have in automated process. So so in terms of how to apply these ideas in your organization, so what I like to do is I first ask my customers for the last 5 or 6 pen test reports that they had, and I try to look for these opportunities, right? The things that are relatively simple to check with compliance as code that they keep on seeing on their pen test reports, so that I can say, okay, we start our compliance as code journey here, right? And then after 6 months, I can go back to them and I say, look, you've had 3-4 pen tests in the meantime, you didn't see those problems again, right? And the reason why you didn't was because developers now get benefit from the early feedback loop, and they get the immediate information that it's not done right, and they fix it then and there. You don't need to wait 6 months for them to forget or not know that they should have done a secure cookie to actually do something about it 48 hours before go live, right? And this is how you start building that trust into the process. But then once we start building that trust, we can then expand into integrating some of those outputs directly into the governance process, directly into the ISMS, so that the gatekeepers can start benefiting from these shorter feedback loops in a way that they comprehend. And finally, then we can maybe think of more advanced things, which are currently outside of his or her worldview of what's possible. So I've specifically added blameless post-mortems here, as a true gatekeeper will likely have written the disciplinary process, and his command and control view of the world may say those words, but not really mean it. Okay, or suggesting to a gatekeeper that we'll do chaos engineering or in purposely breaking things in production, it's not going to bode well, right? We're going to have to build up to that and eventually be at a place where all those practices are part of what the gatekeeper sees as preferable. But that's a journey, right? We need to always understand what is within the scope of the preferable to both the gatekeepers and to the rainbow makers, and work within what they believe is possible, right? And help them go through that journey iteratively. And something similar for the rainbow makers. So they may currently lack security expertise. So starting by introducing something like Stride in threat modeling on a whiteboard and getting them to review and identify some of those threats on their current processes and practices is a good way to start. So what I usually do once I start working with a new company, with their engineering teams, is I introduce Stride, and then I stop and I say, okay, now let's not even threat model. Just tell me what problems that you believe are currently security problems you have, and let's try and think of them in light of Stride. Right? So Stride is meant to be a mnemonic, not a categorization system. It's not very good as categorization, but it's good to have people start thinking about these other types of things I should be looking out for. Right? And that way we can start building the shared language so we can have more targeted conversations about security. And then we can think about introducing baseline tooling, introducing policy as code for things that they can repeat. So for instance, if I'm giving them the hardening guidelines for a Jenkins deployment, right? So let's try and do this with compliance as code, write some tests that we can add to make sure that our Jenkins is always compliant. So within their current agency, so the things they already own, let's try and make them do security, right, on the things that they already own. And this is independent of the relationship with the gatekeepers, which is sometimes key, right? So in some of the customers that I work with, I try to do independent work with both of the teams, right? And help them first on getting some shared language that we can then, after a month or two, start actually getting to have direct conversations, right? But establishing a baseline and starting to see how we can then grow to have shared conversations is a good thing to do. Again, because there's usually cultural issues in organizations where these areas already have lots of tension when I start working with them, right? So we starting to work in parallel with both, in my opinion, is detrimental. So I usually try and work independently and then further on try to integrate them. And this is how we can think about developing and consuming some of these baseline tooling, security visibility, and then start actually implementing some methodologies for threat modeling. And eventually, I would like them to be an integral part of the risk analysis and fully owning the security, their own security backlogs. Right? But this is something that, again, needs to be built and to be worked on. So, but also looking at the artifacts is not enough. So we need to understand their interactions. That's why I believe, and I've been researching, so those of you who follow me on LinkedIn and Twitter have probably seen me rant about some of these things. I've been researching a lot on social practice theory, which breaks down elements of practice into three. So we've got meanings, which includes symbolic meanings, ideas, and aspirations. It includes competences. So it's about skills and know-how and techniques that we can apply. And finally, it's about materials. Right, so things, technologies, artifacts, code, whatever we want to do it. And understanding that they're not just interdependent, but they're actually mutually shaping, right? So we, as an industry, security needs to be much more strategic and careful about how we approach introduction of new technology, about what competences we think are required, and actually the meaning of practices. So this is an example using threat modeling. So we should probably start by, as I was referring to previously, start with introducing Thread on a whiteboard. Right? But eventually you probably want to move to threat modeling as code, right? As the material that you're using to do threat modeling. You can start by using Stride and potentially move up to work to a full-fledged methodology. And in terms of categories, maybe start with something like OWASP Top 10, and then eventually move to something like CWE or CAPEC that is much more thorough. Right? But what we need to understand is that these things need to go hand in hand. There's no point in getting practices or components or know-how that is very advanced if your team is not yet ready, doesn't understand the meaning of what that is, right? So thinking of these in maturity stages is important. And this is my favorite example of evolved meaning in security practices. That is a quote from my business partner, Imran. So his quote is, in a DevOps world, a pen test is not for finding security issues, it's to improve process. Right? I think this quote fully embodies the aspect of evolution of meanings, right? In that the competences and the materials that are used to perform a pen test haven't necessarily changed over the past decade, but the meaning of the practice needs to change if we are going to integrate and adapt them to this new way of doing things to DevOps. And I think this is key, understanding what the evolution of the meaning of the practices at the cultural level within the organization means to the different stakeholders that are part of them. And lastly, we've got team interactions that also evolve, right? So gatekeepers and rainbow makers, when they coexist in organizations, they usually live in significant tension. So for most, we really need to reset to square one and start things at the beginning, as their current organization structure and potentially built up tensions that exist between departments probably assumes that people can just provide services to each other. I do this for you and you're doing this for me, but it's unlikely that they can be effective at doing so, right? Because it's missing the elephant in the room, which is we don't have shared meanings, we don't have effective traceability, and we may not have the efficient communication channels to build on, right? And if those aren't in place, just thinking in terms of areas providing a service to each other, there's a lot that is going to be missed in the gap between the work as imagined by the gatekeepers and the work as done by the rainbow makers. There's going to be a very big difference between what those two things actually look like. So using concepts from team topologies and particularly the three interactions mode, I think is a great place to start on this. So we really should be going back to a true collaboration mode. And this may even imply that we need to have one team and actually break those silos and have people actually work together for a while. So there, with that level of collaboration, we can start agreeing on governance mapping. So how are you going to manage metadata? Excuse me. So how we are going to expose each of the different parts of the single team to practices like threat modeling and risk assessment, so that people can actually have a better appreciation of each other's roles in mental models, and what are the constraints and trade-offs that they consider when they are doing those practices. And this is also likely to require change to the management systems themselves, right? Either through metadata or actual changes on the workflows, in order to enable this effective communication and in one part of the process informing the other. Then we can move to a more facilitation approach, where we can start separating some of those practices and establish clearer boundaries between the scope of each team and an overall focus on training. So what does the other party need to know to be effective at passing information in a way that I understand? Okay. And finally, we may get to a point where all of those are in place and we can have fully defined interfaces with actual APIs or libraries that the development teams can use, for instance, or what's called team APIs with regards to having very well defined services that when I get an output from a part of the process and goes to a different team, the team fully understands what that output means, right? So there's no need to translate, and there's effective traceability between them. And at this point, then we can have properly informed and supportive roadmaps and mainly be managing exceptions, allowing everyone to be effective and not have all the cognitive load that could come by the expectation that everyone needs to be an expert in all of the domains of security. This will also help in breaking communication barriers. But this is likely to take time, right? And for many, this is probably going to be measured in years, right? So having realistic expectations is also important. So coming back to the title of this talk, should you DevSecOps or not? So if we agree that constraints on both archetypes are centered around trust by the gatekeepers on the process and the people, and agency and ownership on the side of the rainbow makers, then I think that it would be naive to assume that the organizational practices exist that will create secure systems and promote collaboration around security matters. So giving it a name whilst we build those organizational practices allows us to discuss them and address them. But at some point, I think it may be detrimental to culture and ownership. Right? So my opinion, right, this is all in the realm of opinion, is that it may be a useful term to introduce so that different archetypes can start having meaningful conversations about direction of travel, and each of them will need to, and what each of them will need to do, right? And change in order to integrate security into their DevOps practices, up to the point where it can become detrimental. Right? So some questions that I think should be asked to determine if you should be using the word DevSecOps or not is, do you have tooling in place which informs the rainbow makers of the security state? Do your gatekeepers understand what any controls that you have in place mean for their compliance regimes? Do gatekeepers and rainbow makers set mutually supportive roadmaps, or are they selected in isolation? Do rainbow makers have a sense of agency and ownership of security of their products? And do product owners understand and have a backlog of security work that is validated and agreed by the teams? Right? If any of those, the answers to those questions are no, then I think that yes, you should be adopting DevSecOps as something to discuss and adopt. Right? So my opinion is that one should use the label strategically and whilst it's providing value, but also develop situational awareness to understand when it may be the right time to move on from that. So I'd argue that until we have traceability, policy as code, teams owning backlogs, and with agency over the shape and form of security on their products, that it helps and allows one to discuss in deep into the body of knowledge, which is still being developed, detailing these practices. Right? So if you need to have something to talk about integrating security, calling it DevSecOps, that both gatekeepers and rainbow makers can go on Google or can approach organizations such as us and such as others on the market that exist, and is a good place to find the information that you're looking for and that may be beneficial to both parties. Because at some point you want to be in the position where the name DevOps in the organization is giving you all the security that you need in a way that is sustainable, and that allows both rainbow makers and gatekeepers to have these conversations. But know that whether you use it or not does not change the job to be done, right? The job to be done is the same, whether you decide to adopt the word DevSecOps in your organization or not. What it takes to get security working is probably likely not going to change, right? And that's the work that we need to be doing. And just as kind of a final note, and all of you know that I always like to be a bit controversial, is that if your strategy mentions the word DevSecOps or security in DevOps and you're not helping your governance teams benefit from short feedback loops and training them to understand DevOps, not increasing the agency and ownership of security across your product or project teams in their language and not yours, not enabling the best possible developer and engineering experience of security that you can afford, and not actively trying to break down siloed barriers and connect the governance systems so that people understand traceability and have shared language, then you're probably doing it wrong. And there we come to the end of the session. So you've got all of our my details over there on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Medium. And I'd also like to just do a note with regards to Open Security Summit. So we're going to start now at the beginning of June with some pre-summit training sessions that will happen over 2 weeks. And then you've got the pages over there. So Practical DevSecOps, we're going to be a part of it. So we're going to be doing some free training on SAST, DAST, compliance as code. And I'm also going to be doing some workshops there about strategy. So particularly on applying wordly mapping and Canavan framework and team topologies. So there's a lot of good things that that I'm sure a lot of you will benefit from. And if you could help spread the message, that would be great. Thank you.
Great. We got a bunch of questions, so I would take probably questions now, and
Yep.
they can talk to you, reach out to you on Twitter or LinkedIn with the links there. So
Great.
So one question we have here is that we are, as I mean, when he says we, I assume compliance or security in general are bound to our due diligence initiatives, right? Where do we stand between letting the developers do their job versus assuming they are going to implement controls correctly and probably explaining to a prosecutor during a breach review that, hey, we were just trying to remove all the gatekeeping, right?
Yep.
Pretty
No, that's a good challenge. A good challenge, right? So that's where I think it needs to. So we need to understand that, and that was the whole reason why I built the archetype model, right? It's because these two views of the world are usually conflicting, right? So to many organizations, particularly in highly regulated ones or organizations that need to go through through compliance regimes, you are unlikely to be starting from scratch, right? So you're already going to have your policies. You're already going to have some of the practices that people already do, right? So I would never be an advocate to just say, okay, even if this is not working, let's remove everything, right? So that's why I'm actually going to bring this up again, right? This is, I think, the slide that should be used in a strategic way, right? What we need to understand is that set yourself an objective for 6 months to a year, where the both parts of the equation need to be trying to do this. Right? We're going to have to bring the compliance or the typical InfoSec teams on a journey to start trusting more, but that trust is going to have to be built on. Right? So we're going to need to be starting to collaborate, such as implementing a security baseline and the compliance team starting to get visibility of the outputs of those tests being run in CI/CD, right? So that trust is built over time, right? No one's going to wake up to share these slides and next week everything is going to be fine, right? That's not realistic. That's not going to happen. But what it means is we need to stop changing the focus of what our security programs need to look like from let's develop this control, let's put this thing or that other technology. And we need to start thinking of what is my security program doing to increase my trust on the process, if you're on the gatekeeping side of things. And if you're on the rainbow maker side of things, is how is the security program helping me on getting more agency and ownership over security, while helping me build the knowledge that I need to be autonomous at doing it. But so it will be in the combination on having these two key objectives in mind. So the trust and the agency, and how security transformation needs to be helping those two things kind of meet in the middle, right? And that's the whole. That was the whole idea behind why I've made this model a triangle, is because both of them need to be right if you're going to do this right. Does that make sense?
Great. We have one more question from, again, Amazing Didar. So the question is, how does the evolution start from collaboration and go to separation? In my org, I'm trying to get collaboration, and it feels like the end goal, and that feels like an end goal to me, collaboration.
No, I don't think it is, and that's where we go back to the ideas behind the team topologies book, which we'll be talking about in at Open Security Summit as well. The problem with collaboration is mainly one of cognitive load, Right? So high levels of collaboration have requirements for high cognitive load, right? And expect too much from people. The problem with that is that if we're always reliant on high collaborative environments, it means that all the mental processing capacity of the developers and the engineers that should be focused more on delivering value to the functional things to the organization are going to be spent on dealing with security, right? And that's not very beneficial, right? Because at that point in time, because all of us have a capacity, a ceiling to our cognitive load, how much we can take and still be effective, that would mean that they would probably stop being as active in their development on their functional things in order to focus on security instead, right? And that's not beneficial. Right? So what we need to do, which is also what Manuel Paes from Team Topologies suggests, and I didn't go to that level of detail in this talk because there was just too much content to add in. But what we need to think is about collaboration with what he calls stream-aligned teams, which he doesn't like it, but roughly translates to product teams, and help understand what are the capabilities that they need, right? And this will typically go in the form of a baseline. So things such as what we talked about, secret scanning, static code analysis, and all of those. And then after we develop a capability that the development teams can use, then we should be aiming to push it down at the platform level. So that is something that the development teams can consume from the platform, right? And then we should only be introducing security practices that are relevant to the scope and the time span of what people are doing, right? So bringing all of the development teams in risk management exercises, multi-year plans, that doesn't fit the types of stories they tell each other, right? That doesn't necessarily make sense in their context. What we need to get better at is to translate what we are doing in risk assessment to help inform what the developers and engineers can do, which is threat modeling, because that's how they can integrate the outputs of practices such as risk analysis into what does it mean to me, what specification or what can I develop that is going to meet this requirement in the language and the types of stories that I'm used to telling and that I'm comfortable with. But putting some of these kind of multi-year concerns for the engineers to specify or to get a specification around them is not usually beneficial, because that's not the time span that they're used in dealing with.
Great. I think we will call it a day now.
Yep.
We do have a couple of more questions. I think we will take it offline. Sorry if we couldn't take it at the moment, but thanks a lot, Mario. That was amazing session, and we got some amazing feedback just over the Twitter that probably the best presentation I've seen in years. It's given me tons of ideas and links to follow upon. Awesome job and congratulations. I just want to share that with you guys.
Thank you.
So
yeah, I'll go on Twitter in a bit and see if I see any more questions. I'll try my best to respond to them.
Great. Thanks a lot for taking time and spending us with the community here. And I hope we will have more such sessions in near future. Now, I think we are at the end of the session today, but if you would like to enjoy these kind of this kind of content again, please do follow us and Mario on Twitter or LinkedIn. We usually do a lot of these sessions on a weekly basis. Because of COVID, we have reduced it to give some room to others to breathe. So, but we're going to start doing on a weekly basis these kind of presentations and workshops. So do consider follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, and whatnot. Once again, thank you. And with that, we would say goodbye.